The jungle was alive with rain. Thick, tropical sheets pounded the palm fronds and pooled in the muddy trenches carved around Henderson Field. Flares hissed in the distance, their ghostly light cutting through the downpour for only a second before fading into darkness. Along the southern perimeter, men crouched behind barbed wire and sandbags, fingers wrapped tight around M1917 Brownings, waiting for a sound. Any sound. That didn't belong to the night. At 22 hours, the jungle began to whisper. Then the whispers turned into the muffled tramp of hundreds of boots, sloshing through the muck. They were close. Too close. Machine Gunner Sergeant John Basilone checked his lines one last time. His guns had been spaced for interlocking fire. Every angle overlapping, every sector covered. Behind him, the airstrip's silhouette lay silent in the darkness, its value measured not in concrete or dirt, but in lives. The Japanese 17th Army had vowed to retake it at all costs. Lightning cracked across the sky, and in that flash, Basilone saw them, hundreds of figures rushing from the tree line, bayonets glinting, voices rising into a single, furious roar. The battle for Henderson Field had begun. By dawn, the Americans would still hold the airfield, and 3,200 Japanese soldiers would never return from the jungle. By mid-1942, the tide of the Pacific War hung in a delicate balance. Japan's forces still stretched from Burma to the Solomon Islands, a vast empire carved in just 6 months. But beyond that reach, American industry was awakening. The U.S. Navy, bloodied at Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, had struck back at Midway. Now it sought a foothold from which to halt Japan's expansion and begin the long road west. That foothold appeared almost by accident. Allied scouts noticed that Japanese engineers were building an airstrip on an obscure island called Guadalcanal, a humid, malaria-ridden jungle at the southern edge of the Solomon Chain. If completed, that runway could threaten the sea routes between the United States and Australia. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, planners knew what it meant. Whoever controlled that strip would control the entire South Pacific corridor. On 7th August 1942, U.S. Marines of the 1st Marine Division landed in what became the first major American offensive of the war. The landings met little opposition at first. Japanese construction troops fled into the jungle. Within days, the Marines seized the half-finished airfield and renamed it Henderson Field, in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine pilot killed at Midway. But from that moment on, every Japanese general from Rabaul to Tokyo understood the insult. The Americans had invaded imperial territory. What followed was a grinding, 6-month struggle of isolation and attrition. Supplies came by sea convoys under constant air attack. Food ran low. Disease ran rampant. Each side fought not just the enemy, but the jungle itself. Leeches, humidity, rot, and the ever-present stench of decay. By late August, the Japanese launched their first counterattack along the Tenaru River, only to be cut down by pre-sighted machine gun fire. Weeks later, in mid-September, came Edson's Ridge, when Colonel Merritt Edson's raiders and parachutists barely held the high ground overlooking Henderson. Each assault ended the same way. Hundreds of Japanese dead in front of American wire. The airfield still in U.S. hands. But Tokyo could not let go. Intelligence officers believed that the Marines were exhausted, that reinforcements could not arrive in time, and that one massive strike would sweep them into the sea. In October, General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army prepared a new operation. Larger, better equipped, and guided by a single conviction. Retake Henderson Field, or die trying. To the men on both sides, the island no longer seemed strategic. It had become something deeper, a test of endurance, of national will, of survival in a green inferno that devoured the unprepared. And by mid-October 1942, The storm was gathering once again in the jungle south of the airfield. The Japanese plan appeared straightforward on paper. General Masanobu Tsuji, Hyakutake's staff officer known for his ruthless precision, mapped a wide enveloping maneuver. The 2nd Division, under Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama, would march through dense jungle to strike the southern flank of the American perimeter. A supporting detachment would attack from the west, near the Matanikau River. Coordinated night assaults, artillery, and bayonets would finish what previous waves could not. But maps and reality diverged. The jungle south of Henderson was no ordinary forest. It was a maze of ravines, tangled vines, and sodden ground that swallowed men and mules alike. The Japanese columns, numbering more than 6,000 infantrymen, struggled to advance a few hundred yards per hour. Tropical rain turned trails into rivers. Supply lines collapsed. Soldiers abandoned ammunition boxes and heavy weapons just to keep moving. American reconnaissance flights spotted fragments of their movement, but even then, the Marines couldn't fully grasp what was coming. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commander of the 1st Marine Division, had extended his perimeter around the airfield, knowing that an attack was imminent but uncertain from which direction. On the southern line, he placed one of his most reliable officers, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, commanding the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. Puller's men dug in along a rough front, cut through the kunai grass and palms, reinforced by sandbags, wire, and shallow trenches. To their right, newly arrived soldiers from the 164th Infantry Regiment, the 1st U.S. Army troops to join the battle, extended the line. They were fresh from the States, green to jungle combat but determined to prove themselves alongside the Marines. The men of both units worked through the night to interlock their fields of fire. By mid-October, Henderson Field had become a living symbol of defiance. Every crate of food, every shell, every wounded man came by sea under the constant threat of Japanese naval bombardment. The Marines called their convoys the Cactus Express, after the island's code name. The Japanese called their nightly reinforcement runs the Tokyo Express, sleek destroyers that raced down the slot under cover of darkness, bringing men and ammunition to Tassafaronga and retreating before dawn. Each side knew the other's rhythm. The Americans ruled the day with the Cactus Air Force, an improvised collection of F-4F Wildcats, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and Army P-39s. The Japanese owned the night with their cruisers and destroyers. But the balance would soon shift. On October 13th, 2 battleships, Congo and Haruna, shelled Henderson for over an hour, destroying nearly half the planes and setting the airfield ablaze. The bombardment shook the island, and the morale of the men defending it. For the Japanese, that thunderous night was the opening signal. Maruyama's troops were already deep in the jungle, struggling toward their assembly areas for the final assault. But their delay, 2 full days slogging through flooded terrain, disrupted coordination with the Western force at Matanikau. By the time the columns reached the American perimeter on the 23rd, they were exhausted, half-starved, and nearly blind in the rain. Still, discipline held. On October 24th, as dusk fell, runners carried orders down the line. Attack at 2200 hours. The signal, a flare. The objective, the destruction of every American position along the southern wire. Inside their muddy trenches, Puller's Marines and the soldiers of the 164th checked their weapons one last time. Ammunition was stacked in ration boxes, belts draped over the mud walls, fuses preset for canister shot on the 37B Métimeter guns. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the jungle fringe, the enemy was forming up, silent and unseen. By midnight, the stillness would break, and the perimeter around Henderson Field would become the crucible of Guadalcanal. By the time the October rains came, the men around Henderson Field had long forgotten what dry felt like. Boots rotted on their feet. Uniforms clung to the skin, stiff with sweat and mud. In the foxholes along the southern perimeter, Marines and Army infantry alike fought against exhaustion as much as the enemy. They lived on half rations, tinned hash, moldy biscuits, and coffee when the fuel lasted. Malaria spread through the ranks faster than ammunition could be resupplied. Men shook under fever while digging in, afraid to sleep too deeply, lest the next flare reveal movement in the jungle. For the Marines who had been there since August, the green newcomers of the 164th Infantry seemed almost fragile at first. Clean gear, pale skin, untested eyes. But within days of sharing trenches, distinctions faded. They fought side by side, swapping stories, sharing cigarettes, and whispering in the dark about home. When the first Japanese probing attack struck the wire, the soldiers didn't break. They held, steady, terrified, but immovable. In letters that would never reach the mainland, some men wrote about the smell, a heavy mix of damp earth, sweat, gun oil, and death. Others confessed they no longer feared dying, only being forgotten. To them, Guadalcanal had become less a place and more a test, a brutal measure of whether humanity could endure a world reduced to rain, mud, and fear. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller was a soldier of pure instinct. Before the battle, he had walked his lines again and again, studying every fold of terrain, every field of fire. Where others saw mud, he saw geometry, arcs of coverage, machine gun overlap, artillery patterns. Puller knew the Japanese preferred night assaults. He anticipated infiltration attempts, bayonet charges, and silent crawls through the brush. So he built his defenses for it. Barbed wire was layered in depth, not in single rows. Gaps were seeded with mines or pre-sighted by mortars. Machine gun positions were staggered. No gun could fire without another watching its flank. Supporting those guns were the 37mm anti-tank pieces with canister rounds, shotgun blasts of steel balls designed to mow down attackers in the dark. Puller positioned them where the jungle opened slightly, knowing the Japanese would be forced into the clearings. Further back, artillerymen of the 11th Marines had already registered their guns. They had exact coordinates for every potential avenue of attack, each marked with stakes and range cards. If the perimeter broke, the next line would be a curtain of high-explosive shells falling just beyond friendly trenches. It was a defense born of attrition, of men who had learned the jungle's logic the hard way. Puller didn't expect to hold forever. He expected to kill as many as possible before the line collapsed. But he also knew the Americans had one crucial advantage: discipline in communication. Every man along the perimeter had rehearsed fallback signals. Every radio operator knew the call codes by heart. And when the night came alive with screaming and fire, that network, strained, sputtering, but intact, would hold the entire defensive web together. By October 1942, Henderson Field was more than an airstrip. It was the single most valuable square mile of dirt in the South Pacific. Everything revolved around it. Every operation, every convoy, every casualty came down to whether that strip stayed open or not. Its value wasn't in sophistication. The field was primitive, its surface little more than crushed coral and mud. Yet it gave the Americans what the Japanese could never fully regain: daylight dominance. From dawn to dusk, aircraft of the Cactus Air Force, a patchwork mix of Marine, Navy, and Army planes, rose from its battered runway to strike Japanese ships, troops, and supply lines. Even at its weakest, Henderson could put fighters into the air by noon. Mechanics worked through the night under flickering lanterns, patching bullet holes with scavenged metal, cannibalizing wrecks for parts. The field itself was ringed by foxholes and anti-aircraft guns, its perimeter guarded by infantry who understood that every yard of ground defended was Another sortie launched the next morning, when the Japanese battleships Kongo and Haruna shelled the airfield on October 13th. Their shells cratered the runway and set fuel stores ablaze. But by noon the next day, bulldozers had flattened the rubble, and aircraft were flying again. Henderson's survival was a triumph of improvisation, a blend of logistics, mechanics, and sheer stubbornness. In every sense, it was a technological miracle, not because of its machines, but because of the men who refused to let those machines fail. Two names would become legend after that night: Chesty Puller and John Basilone. Their leadership styles couldn't have been more different, yet they meshed perfectly in the crucible of Henderson Field. Puller led from presence, a stocky, sharp-voiced officer who paced the front line with a cigar clenched between his teeth, unbothered by sniper fire. His men trusted him because he never asked them to do what he wouldn't. He was the kind of leader who memorized every gun placement, every platoon's field of fire. To him, command meant proximity. Basilone, by contrast, was a machine gunner to the core. On the night of October 24th, he commanded 2 sections of heavy Brownings. His discipline was absolute. He drilled his crews relentlessly, rehearsing ammunition changes and barrel swaps in total darkness. When the attack came, that preparation would become the difference between life and annihilation. Puller orchestrated the defense. Basilone embodied it. Through that synergy, strategic, foresight from command and fearless execution. From the trenches, the Marine perimeter held under conditions that would have broken lesser units. Leadership in Guadalcanal wasn't medals or speeches. It was keeping men firing when the world collapsed around them. And that's exactly what they did. On the other side of the jungle, Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama believed his 2nd Division was about to crush the Americans. Intelligence had told him the Marines were down to barely 2,000 effectives, short on ammunition and morale. His soldiers, seasoned veterans of China, were confident that one decisive night assault could reclaim the island. But by the time they reached their jumping-off point, that confidence had turned to exhaustion. Men had marched over 20 miles through trackless jungle, hauling mortars and machine guns by hand, soaked to the bone. Food was gone. Many collapsed from hunger before even seeing the enemy's wire. Still, discipline forced them forward. When the first flare went up, some units attacked too early, others too late. Coordination dissolved. Radio contact between battalions failed. Yet they charged anyway, straight into overlapping fields of fire. Japanese soldiers fought with fanatical bravery, charging through machine gun fire in suicidal waves. Maruyama's staff, cut off from the front, reported by midnight that Henderson Field had been captured. It was a lie born of confusion, but it made its way up the chain of command, celebrated prematurely at Rabaul. In truth, his regiments were being shredded to pieces. What began as a disciplined offensive would, by dawn, become a massacre, and by the next night, a tragedy of annihilation. At 2200 hours, the first flare rose above the tree line. It hung for a heartbeat in the rain, casting the jungle into stark white and black. Then the world exploded. Japanese mortars opened first, their rounds hissing through the night and bursting behind the Marine lines. Shrapnel ripped through palm trunks. Sparks rained over the soaked foxholes. Within seconds, the forest in front of Puller's sector lit up with the flashes of hundreds of rifles. The 29th Infantry Regiment, veterans of Shanghai, charged through the mud, bayonets gleaming, shouting, "Banzai!" until their voices vanished under machine gun fire. Sergeant John Basilone's machine gun crews were waiting. His 2 sections of water-cooled M1917 Brownings sat at the center of the line, barrels preheated, ammunition stacked in crates, every gun zeroed on pre-measured ranges. When the first silhouettes emerged from the jungle, Basilone gave the signal. The guns opened like thunder. Each one spat a continuous red trace that cut through the night. A curtain of death. The noise was deafening, the recoil shaking the mud walls of every pit. Within minutes, belt after belt ran dry. Basilone moved between his guns, hauling ammunition under fire, shouting orders over the chaos. When one gun jammed from overheating, he grabbed a spare barrel with bare hands, burning his palms but keeping it in the fight. All across Puller's line, the story was the same. Marines fired until barrels glowed, then switched to carbines, pistols, or anything that worked. The 37mm 719 mm guns hurled canister rounds into the darkness, thousands of steel balls that turned the jungle into a storm of death. Every burst shredded dozens of attackers, yet still the waves came on. At times, the Japanese broke through the wire. Screaming soldiers threw satchel charges and grenades into foxholes. Close-quarters fights erupted across the perimeter. Bayonets, knives, fists. The defenders counterattacked with grenades and shotguns, clearing the trenches yard by yard. Puller, drenched in mud and rain, moved along the front with his radio operator, coordinating artillery fire on his own positions to break up penetrations. By midnight, the line was nearly overwhelmed. 2 Marine machine guns were destroyed, another crew dead. Basilone, running low on ammunition, made the fateful decision that would later define him. With only one functioning gun left and hundreds of Japanese pressing forward, he sprinted nearly 200 yards through enemy fire to the rear supply line, dragging a belt of ammo over his shoulders. He returned the same way, reloading and firing until dawn. When the attack finally faltered, the ground in front of his guns was carpeted with bodies, entire platoons cut down within yards of the wire. The few Japanese who reached the trenches were killed in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. By 0300 hours, what remained of the 29th 99th Regiment was in full retreat, leaving behind piles of abandoned rifles, bayonets, and shattered helmets. The rain kept falling, masking the moans of the wounded. Basilone's hands were blistered and bleeding, his uniform soaked with oil and blood. Yet he kept moving along the line, making sure every man was accounted for. Puller radioed division headquarters with a simple message. "We've held. Send ammo." As dawn approached, the first light revealed a sight few would ever forget. A sea of bodies tangled in wire and mud. The jungle littered with broken banners and helmets marked with the rising sun. For the Americans, the night had lasted forever. For the Japanese, it had ended everything. But General Maruyama hadn't yet accepted defeat. He still had men, and he would send them in again the next night. The dawn of October 25, 1942, rose over Henderson Field, like the aftermath of a nightmare. Smoke still drifted from the tree line. The rain had eased, leaving a haze that smelled of cordite, blood, and burned metal. The Marines could finally see what they had done. The ground beyond the southern wire was nothing but torn vegetation and corpses. In some places, the dead lay stacked 3 deep, but there was no time for relief. As the exhausted defenders scavenged ammunition and replaced barrels, Puller knew it wasn't over. Enemy movement was still heard in the jungle. Japanese scouts fired sporadically through the morning, probing for weak points. By noon, intercepted radio traffic confirmed the unthinkable. Maruyama's main body was preparing another attack that night, larger than the first. The Marines reinforced what positions they could. The 164th Infantry shifted to cover gaps, laying new wire under fire. Engineers dragged ammunition and food forward through waist-deep mud. The wounded were carried out on improvised stretchers. Wooden planks, doors, even aircraft panels. That night, the jungle awoke again. At 1930 hours, a flare lit the southern sky. The 16th Infantry Regiment and remnants of the 29th surged forward, this time in greater numbers. They advanced with eerie discipline, firing as they moved, trying to find a seam in the line. Puller's command post shook as mortars landed within yards. At the front, Basiloni's guns, reduced now to a single operational weapon, held the center. His crew had been fighting for nearly 24 hours with almost no rest. Yet they stayed behind the tripod, feeding belts, clearing jams, and firing until the gun shuddered under the heat. When the barrel began to warp, Basilone switched to a spare and kept going. To the east, a section of the 164th Infantry came under direct assault. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers emerged from the dark screaming, hurling grenades and climbing over the wire. The soldiers held fire until they could see the whites of their eyes, then unleashed rifle and automatic fire that cut the charge in half. When the survivors reached the trenches, it became hand-to-hand chaos. Bayonets and shovels flashed in the rain. Officers led counterattacks with pistols drawn. Puller's radio crackled with fragmented reports. Left flank holding, center under heavy pressure. Enemy infiltrating rear positions. He ordered all available artillery to fire on preset coordinates, some within just 50 yards of friendly lines. The ground shook as 105mm shells detonated across the jungle. Trees exploded into splinters. The Japanese attack disintegrated, but small groups continued to push through the smoke. By Oro 1 Noer, the battlefield was a vision of hell. Mud, smoke, and fire blurred into one endless roar. Some Japanese soldiers crawled under the wire pretending to be dead, only to rise and stab at sentries. Others charged burning machine gun nests with bayonets, dying within feet of their targets. On the far right of the perimeter, the 3rd Battalion, 164th Infantry unleashed point-blank rifle volleys into the mass of attackers. Every muzzle flash lit faces, desperate, terrified, determined. When the final Japanese charge broke around 03:30, the survivors stumbled back into the jungle, leaving the ground soaked and silent. Puller called for illumination flares. As they drifted down, the scale of destruction became clear. Thousands of bodies lay in heaps along the wire. In one sector, Marine engineers counted over 1,000 dead within 100 yards of Basilone's position. The enemy had never come closer to breaking the line, and never would again. At dawn, rain returned, washing the blood into the soil. Henderson's planes, patched and battered, lifted off once more to strike the retreating columns. From above, pilots reported long trails of bodies along the jungle paths. By midday, Maruyama's army was broken. Units that had once marched, in precision, now crawled through the mud, starving, leaderless, carrying the wounded on bamboo poles. Of the 6,000 men who had begun the assault, nearly half were dead or missing. The Americans had lost barely 100. The Japanese High Command refused to believe it. Reports from Rabaul still claimed victory, but for the men who survived those nights, the truth was written in the silence after the guns stopped, a silence so complete that even the jungle seemed to mourn. When Puller finally walked the line that morning, he found Basilone sitting beside his gun, bandaged hands resting on the receiver, eyes red with exhaustion. The Marine perimeter had held. Henderson Field still stood, and the Japanese army south of it had ceased to exist. By sunrise on October 26, 1942, Guadalcanal was quiet again. The thunder that had shaken the island for 2 nights straight had faded into a steady rain. Smoke curled lazily above the jungle canopy where mortars had burned the trees. And, for the men of the 1st Marine Division and the 164th Infantry, the silence was almost unbearable, because they knew what it meant. The Japanese weren't regrouping. They weren't preparing another assault. They were gone. Patrols pushed cautiously into the jungle that morning, rifles ready. What they found defied imagination. The southern approaches to Henderson Field were carpeted with bodies, many still clutching rifles or grenades that had never been used. The 29th and 16th Infantry Regiments of the Japanese 2nd Division had ceased to exist as fighting units. In some areas, the corpses lay so thick that Marines could walk 100 yards without touching the ground. Others were found tangled in barbed wire or still hanging from trees where they'd been thrown by explosions. The stench hit within minutes, sickly and unforgettable. Bulldozers later buried many of them in long trenches just beyond the perimeter. The Americans counted over 3,200 enemy dead, and estimated hundreds more carried off by retreating comrades or lost in the jungle. Their own casualties were light by comparison, roughly 86 killed and 200 wounded across 2 nights of continuous fighting. It was, by any measure, a one-sided slaughter. In division headquarters, Major General Alexander Vandegrift received Puller's after-action report, concise, clinical, written in the language of logistics and distances. But beneath the words was the essence of the Marine Corps itself, endurance under impossible odds. For his leadership, Puller would later receive the Navy Cross. For his unyielding defense of the machine gun line, Sergeant John Basilone would be awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Marine enlisted man of the war to receive it. The citation would read, "For extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in action, while holding his line against repeated Japanese attacks, he personally fought and directed fire until the enemy was annihilated." When reporters later asked Puller what had made the difference, his answer was blunt. "Good men, good guns, and we didn't quit." But the real victory went beyond courage. It was logistics, ammunition that somehow reached the line through torrents of rain, artillery that stayed in action when radios failed, bulldozers that repaired Henderson Field by daylight so planes could fly again. Every element of the defense had worked in desperate harmony. The Japanese survivors, meanwhile, were in full retreat. Starving and disease-ridden, many collapsed along the jungle trails before ever reaching their supply points. Some were eaten by crocodiles along the Lunga River. Others were cut down by aircraft strafing the roads. Entire battalions vanished. For the Japanese command at Rabaul, the scale of the loss was unthinkable. Initial dispatches had claimed that the airfield was captured. Now, days later, reports trickled in from scattered survivors. And the truth was catastrophic. Tokyo received confirmation. The battle for Henderson Field had failed completely. The illusion of Japanese invincibility, built over a decade of expansion, had shattered in the mud of Guadalcanal. But on the island itself, no one spoke of victory, only survival. The victory at Henderson Field was more than a tactical success. It was a psychological turning point in the Pacific War. For the first time, a full-scale Japanese ground assault had been repelled and annihilated. It proved, both to the world and to the men who fought there, that Japan's armies could be stopped. In the weeks that followed, the Americans consolidated their positions. Reinforcements from the 2nd Marine Division and additional Army regiments began to arrive, ferried under constant threat from Japanese air and naval attacks. The perimeter around Henderson expanded. What had once been a desperate beachhead was now a fortified bastion. The Cactus Air Force, rebuilt from wreckage, resumed daily operations. By early November, it could field over 80 operational aircraft, enough to dominate daylight skies over the Solomon Sea. Every Japanese ship that ventured within range faced near certain attack. The island that Tokyo once called a stepping stone to Australia had become a graveyard for its men and ships alike. For the Japanese, the losses went far beyond the thousands killed in front of Henderson's Wire. The 2nd Division was crippled. its officers dead or missing. Supply routes collapsed as American aircraft interdicted the Tokyo Express. What little food or ammunition reached the island came at enormous cost. Disease, starvation, and exhaustion did what artillery could not. By December, General Hyakutake's 17th Army reported itself no longer capable of offensive operations. His troops, once proud veterans of China and Malaya, were reduced to scavenging for roots and insects. Their morale sank into despair. Tokyo, unwilling to accept the inevitable, ordered further reinforcements, but each convoy was savaged by air power from Henderson and submarines along the slot. Then, in mid-November, the desperate Japanese effort to crush the airfield culminated in the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Across 3 nights of horrific sea fighting, both navies bled heavily, but the Americans held. Henderson's planes, repaired and rearmed each dawn, bombed the remnants of the Japanese fleet as it tried to withdraw. By January 1943, the Imperial General Headquarters finally conceded what its soldiers already knew. Guadalcanal was lost. In a secret evacuation under the code name Operation K, over 10,000 surviving Japanese troops were withdrawn under cover of darkness. They left behind their dead, their equipment, and the myth of Japanese invincibility. For the Americans, the victory carried lessons written in blood and mud. It showed that discipline, logistics, and air superiority could overcome even the fiercest enemy. It validated the Marine doctrine of perimeter defense and combined arms, and it transformed the perception of the U.S. military from a nation reeling from Pearl Harbor to a force capable of offensive war in the Pacific. When news reached the United States, few civilians understood the scale of what had happened. Newspapers simply said the Marines had held Guadalcanal. But for the men who fought there, those words carried everything. The rain, the mud, the endless nights, and the knowledge that they had survived when thousands had not. The Japanese called it the Island of Death. The Americans called it a beginning. Because from the moment, Henderson Field stayed in U.S. hands. The Pacific War's direction changed forever. In the vast, brutal geography of the Second World War, few patches of ground held such disproportionate meaning as Henderson Field. It was not a fortress, nor a city, nor even a proper base, just a strip of mud and coral carved into the belly of a forgotten island. Yet from that strip, an empire began to unravel. For the men who fought there, Guadalcanal was not about strategy or doctrine. It was about endurance, about holding a line through hunger, exhaustion, and fear so deep it hollowed the soul. Every night was a test of willpower. Every dawn, a reprieve earned by comrades who would never see home again. The victory did not come from superior numbers or technology, but from the human capacity to adapt, to fight smarter, to refuse collapse. Marines and soldiers who had never seen jungle before learned its language: where to dig, where to wait, how to survive. Pilots rebuilt wrecked aircraft with scavenged parts and flew them until they disintegrated. Mechanics forged weapons from scrap. Medics fought death with nothing but bandages and morphine. And somewhere in that chaos, men like Puller and Basilone emerged, not as legends yet, but as proof of what discipline, courage, and grit could achieve when the world seemed on fire. Their names would echo through generations, but on that island, they were simply men doing what needed to be done so that others might live another hour. When historians later called Guadalcanal the turning point of the Pacific, they spoke in the language of maps and campaigns. But for those who crouched behind the wire, clutching rusted rifles under tropical rain, it was something simpler, the moment when survival itself became victory. The jungle reclaimed the trenches long ago. The wire rusted away. Yet even now, the wind that sweeps over the quiet runway carries an echo of machine guns hammering through the storm, of shouted orders, of silence after impossible noise. It was there, in the mud and darkness of 1942, that the myth of invincibility died, and a new chapter in human resilience began.